The Phanteks P400A Digital was our winner for Best Case overall for 2019 and our winner for Best Airflow for 2019. So it won in 2 categories, and we've recommended it all the way up until now. Today we're reviewing the Phanteks P500A, which is a dual system capable case that still goes for high airflow in the front. So they've got 1 layer of ultrafine mesh, they have 3 fans in the front, and it's very clearly airflow driven for this case. But it also has the extra features and a heavy focus on build quality and ease of installation. So the case should come out priced to around $130, which makes it potentially very compelling, and we're here to review it. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and our brand new Gamers Nexus wireframe mouse mat. Aside from being the best way to directly support our long-form investigative reporting, you can also get a custom-made, high-quality mouse mat made with a high-detail 3D design that we created to show off heat sinks, coolers, video cards, and more. The mouse mat uses a stitched blue border for added longevity, a blue rubber underside for unique flair, and a microfiber cloth for smooth tracking. The mat is 36 inches by 12 inches and fits a keyboard and mouse easily. We sold out of the first run in 48 hours, but have more getting made right now. To backorder your mouse mat and ensure you get one in the next run, go to store.gamersnexus.net and backorder yours while reducing our reliance on advertisers, or click the link in the description below. The P400A did really well in testing. The P300A, when we visited that one, that's the $60-ish case. Sometimes it drops to $50, but our biggest gripe with that one was it didn't include enough stock fans, and our belief is that at especially the lower end, the case manufacturers should take it upon themselves to include the fans, because despite how many people in the comments like to say that they buy fans with their system, the fact of the matter is that at a budget like that, the manufacturer is going to beat the pricing you can get, and it's extremely likely that the fans they include will be adequate for most of the audience. So not talking about enthusiast core audience here. So we thought they didn't include enough fans. It did fine though once you added the extra, say $10 to $15 to add 1 to 2 cheaper 120mm fans. But at that point, it's no longer $60, it's $70, $75, maybe $80, and now it's competing with a lot of other stuff. So that was the P300A. Now we're back to see if Phanteks has gotten back on track with its P500A Digital. There's 2 versions of this case. One of them has the 3 fans, RGB, all of that stuff if you care about it. And then the other one is a stripped down version of the case, fewer fans and a bit cheaper. So that would be the option to buy if you want to supply your own fans, and we've got some numbers for you for that as well. So that base model comes with 2 140mm fans that are non-RGB. Phanteks calls its fans DRGB, meaning just addressable RGB. This has 3 of them. That's really the core difference. The lighting is compatible with 3-pin 5-volt headers used by Asus, MSI, ASRock, and well, whoever else uses 3-pin 5-volt headers. But other than the fans, the only other really lighting to speak of is a strip at the top of the front panel and then a strip along the edge of the power supply shroud, both lit up. And they have a built-in controller with baked-in lighting profiles, and then on the DRGB version, the reset button becomes a lighting change button. So that's really the differences between the 2 cases. We need to go through a lot of build notes on the build quality of this thing. Pricing again is $130 MSRP. We're filming this about a month before launch. They gave it to us way in advance. So we'll see how that shakes out on review day, but let's get into it. An unusual amount of effort has gone into the cable management system behind the motherboard tray. Towards the front of the case, the wide cable management channel is covered with extremely long Velcro straps that are screwed into the chassis. This channel has 3 centimeters of clearance for cables, while the other areas behind the motherboard tray have just over 2 centimeters. The screws divide each strap into 2 halves, each of which loops around a hook that's built into the chassis. Critically, these hooks are open, so the straps can be slipped on and off without having to thread them through tiny holes painstakingly. This solves one of the most frustrating aspects of the normal cable tie points. The straps are placed both at the front of the case and at the top edge of the power supply chamber, which covers almost every location that power supply cables must be routed. Credit is due for an exceptional job here. The power supply shroud is also extremely roomy since the hard drive cages aren't installed out of the box, but even when they are installed, they can be positioned forward to leave plenty of cable management room, or at least cable hiding room. A recurring theme with Phanteks cases, especially the more expensive ones, is that they're feature-rich to a fault, to the point that it starts costing more money to the consumer, even if it doesn't really seem like it would. Much like the Evolv X, the P500A has a slot in the rear for an ITX bracket, purchased separately to be fair, but that allows dual system support when combined with a compatible power supply, purchased also separately. Reinforcing this feature is a vertical GPU mount with a riser cable, purchased separately. That can be used to hold a discrete GPU for the secondary system if desired, while the primary system uses the normal horizontal brackets. We can't be too harsh here because these are optional add-ons. They didn't come with the one we're reviewing, but hardly anyone will actually install a secondary system in this case, so we'd caution against one important thing, which is reading too far into a bullet list that sounds like it's adding more and more features that make it competitive against other cases when you're not actually going to use said features. So there are some legitimate users of such configurations, but they're rare. And if you're one of them, cool. Just don't account for all of these features if it's not a dual system you're building. A lot of people also like the idea of dual system builds, but we generally advise against it in these more cramped enclosures. It can work, but you can read our Evolv X review for more thoughts on dual system testing, thermals, and just assembly in general. Where we said we can't be too harsh about some of the previous notes, we can be a little more harsh about a returning feature from the Evolv X: the sliding cable covers at the front of the case and on top of the power supply shroud. We brushed them off with the line, quote, "These aren't especially useful" in our Evolv X review, and they still aren't. They're overcomplicated, they're probably expensive, and as covers, their function is literally to get in the way. That's the definition of its job, and it does that to a fault as well. In addition, the way the stock, fan, and LED cables are routed means that they can be potentially guillotined by the cable covers if they're slightly out of place. If Phanteks is ever looking for a way to cut costs, this is the place to start. The hard drive brackets that Phanteks includes with the case are a better investment. The brackets latch onto each other without screws and can be stacked too high at 3 different locations under the power supply shroud. As many as 4 could be installed simultaneously, although only 2 are included with the case. There are also mounting locations for 6 more brackets behind the cable covers. Moving to the outside of the case for a moment, the glass panel uses one of the best attachment mechanisms. It's a hinge with magnets to hold it closed. The door lifts right off of the hinges. The hinge points are of unequal length so that the panel is easier to line up and reinstall, and there are rubber strips around the edge of the glass for cushioning and sealing the panel. Phanteks has done almost everything right here, with minor exceptions. First, there's not really any handle to pull on, although there is a thin cutout on the front of the panel that allows some grip for this. Second, the panel isn't supported at the bottom edge and can droop slightly, leaving some gaps. And finally, we'd like to see a screw for the glass panel somewhere to secure it just while moving the case, rather than relying purely on the magnets. If you're going to move the case around or pick it up and relocate it, we definitely advise taking the panel off, just 1 for safety and 2 to avoid any swinging door mistakes that could end up with the case damaged. The other side is a great example of how to make a panel out of a sheet of steel without having it be a complete pain in the ass. The sheet metal is thick. The tabs that hook into the case are short and therefore sturdier. The holes they insert into are large and harder to miss. And there are only tabs on 2 sides of the panel, 3 at the front and 2 on the top. This may not sound exciting, but it's innovation in an area which matters. This is a real improvement over the P400A, and it's an improvement over a lot of cases that rely on the older design where you end up bending or torquing the tabs that hold things in place, or needing 4 hands and a chin to install the panel. The front panel has a U-shaped design stamped into it, which we were told at CES was potentially as reinforcement to prevent the front extra wide mesh panel from flexing. The panel attaches to the chassis with a ball and cup snap like other cases in the series, but uses plastic posts molded into the frame of the panel instead. Previously, these were metal posts tacked onto the edge of the metal mesh. The new method is probably cheaper, but seems just as sturdy in our short-term testing. As with the P400A and the P300A, Phanteks uses the ultra-fine metal mesh, but with no additional filter behind it, which allows for better airflow and is what we want to see. As the company's done in the past with other premium cases, Phanteks ships the screws for the P500A sorted into an organizing tray. It's just a plastic box, but without being hyperbolic, this is one of our all-time favorite case accessories. We have drawers and drawers full of extra screws. Probably enough that we could bag them up and ship them out with our store items if we wanted to. But most users buy cases infrequently and will need to keep track of the original hardware for potentially years. NZXT executed this idea way back in the day with the Phantom 820 and similar cases. But in what's probably a painful note for NZXT, Phanteks seems to have clued into the idea. The plastic screw case is great for this, and it can be kept and reused even after the P500A is long gone. The rear ejecting power supply frame is good as well, but the rear ejecting power supply filter, not so much. Because the filter is relatively short, it's not a big deal. But having filters that are easily accessible encourages more regular cleaning. As for the form factor, the usual statement about so-called eATX cases applies here. This case will support motherboards that line up with the CEB form factor, but not SSI EEB. So it's not really appropriate to say that it supports eATX, since that's a made-up form factor that doesn't mean anything. SSI CEB is the actual motherboard support. One strange aspect of the P500A, in contrast to other cases with triple RGB fans that we've reviewed, including the Phanteks' own P400A digital, is that the stock fans are installed inside the chassis behind the fan mounts. Typically, manufacturers choose to put their fans in front of the fan mounts to avoid obstructing the lighting effects. We knew there must have been a reason to choose the layout that they did, maybe thermals or noise problems with certain airflow patterns. Moving the fans to the outside of the chassis, though, revealed the actual issue. They just don't fit. The panel is just deep enough to fit standard 25mm thick case fans at the top and widens toward the bottom, so there are no issues there. But the usable area for the fans inside of the panel is only about 37.5 centimeters tall. This is about 3.5 centimeters shy of the height of all three fans stacked on top of each other. We suspect there may have been an oversight or a change in plans late in development. Many of the images Phanteks sent in their reviewer guide actually depict the case with three fans installed on the front of the chassis, but this is not an accurate representation of what the case looks like. The real case still looks fine, but keep this in mind when looking at the product listing. For water cooling, Phanteks advertises 420mm radiator support in the front of the case, but users should be aware that both the fans and the radiator must be mounted inside the chassis. As usual, we wouldn't recommend mounting 420 or 360mm CLCs in the front of the case anyway, since they'll only easily fit tubes up. The sliding cable covers may also conflict with radiator clearance, but those can be removed. The top radiator and fan mounts are offset away from the front mounts by about 6.5 centimeters, so there should be enough room to use the front and top mounts simultaneously without conflict, depending on your radiator solutions. Usually, top mounts are offset to one side to help clear the motherboard and RAM, but Phanteks hasn't bothered here, since there's more than 7 centimeters of clearance between the top edge of the motherboard and the top of the case. The entire top panel is removable, which isn't really necessary given how much room there is to work in it, but it may make it easier to install liquid cooling, a secondary system, or critically, to not cut your hands up when you're trying to get the EPS 12-volt cable plugged in. Removable fan and radiator mounts are always a good thing. We just wish that the power supply shroud were removable as well. Finally, it's time to get into thermal and noise testing. We stuck mostly to the usual test suites for this case. We had plans to do an additional test with the stock fans mounted to the front of the chassis to find out why Phanteks didn't use this configuration, but as we said earlier, we answered our own question when the fans didn't fit. Instead, we did a test with an extra 120mm exhaust fan tossed in, and a test with just 2 of the 140mm stock fans arranged in an attempt to emulate the stock P500A non-digital. To do this, we left the center intake fan alone, moved one fan to the rear exhaust slot, and then removed the last one entirely, just to give us one more representation on the charts. We'll start with just the P500A and P400A on the charts, then add the rest. Baseline CPU temperature was 50 degrees Celsius over ambient under a torture workload, which was lowered to 47 degrees over ambient by removing the front panel. This is a mesh-fronted case, so it's expected to be that the front panel isn't obstructive, but a difference of 3 degrees between a front panel on and open air is an achievement for Phanteks. Adding an exhaust fan behind the CPU cooler had a similar effect to removing the front panel, with an average of 47 degrees Celsius over ambient. Meanwhile, emulating the P500A non-digital's fan configuration resulted in an average torture CPU temperature of 51 degrees. The single intake fan used for this configuration was positioned directly in front of the GPU, so it would hopefully push cool air both above and below to split the air between the CPU and GPU somewhat equally. Normally, this is an unpleasant compromise, and cases like the Mesh of IC suffer from mediocre stock thermals, with too few case fans trying to do too many things. Here, the result we measured with 2 fans was almost as good as the stock result with 1. The P400A stock case is within 2 degrees of the P500A digital stock result, while the test without a front panel comes down a few more degrees. This is benefited in part by a shorter distance in front to back airflow for the cases. Comparatively, 50 degrees Celsius over ambient for the CPU is good as compared to the rest of the cases we are currently displaying on this truncated chart. But it's not the equal of the stock P400A, which averaged 48 degrees Celsius over ambient. The Cooler Master TD500 was 1 degree warmer, and so is almost every other stock configured case, for that matter. Being beaten by the P400A is a regular occurrence, and if this were any other case, we wouldn't really sweat it. But the P500A needs to compete with its sibling. Fortunately, they're basically within variance or error of each other, or very close to it. The differences can largely be attributed to some changes of distance and slight changes in the front panel. The GPU temperature was 48 degrees Celsius over ambient baseline, down to 46 degrees with the front panel removed, which is another sign that the Phanteks single-layer front panel design is working. Adding the exhaust fan behind the CPU got temperature down to 47 degrees rounded, but the temperature reduction was less than 1 degree, well within error. The average for the non-digital layout was still just 49 degrees, although GPU frequency does fluctuate a bit more. It's proven to be difficult at this point to make the thermals bad in this case at all, even with one of the fans removed. Compared to the other cases, 48 degrees Celsius is excellent, beating the P400A slightly and landing among the best GPU thermals we've measured yet in this test. It's tied with the likes of the Silverstone RV02. Competition is tight here, with the TD500 only a couple degrees warmer at 50 degrees, but the P500A maintains a lead against most of the cases on even the truncated chart. We measured the noise level to be 44.8 dBA at our standardized 20-inch distance, measured at 26 dB for the noise floor, with all 3 case fans at max speed. That's loud overall, and Phanteks stock 140mm fans are a reason for that. They're listed at 1500 RPM, plus or minus the usual 10%, and even though we only saw them hitting about 1300 RPM in our testing, or 1320 when measured with a physical tachometer, that's still a full set of large fans moving very fast right against the front of a case with nothing to block them but a rectangle of mesh. This is comparable to the noise generated by a Silverstone RV02 at full speed as well. In order to bring them down to the 36 dBA threshold that we use for noise normalization, we had to set their speed to about 50%, or about 870 RPM as reported by software. These aren't PWM fans, so 50% doesn't mean a literal 50% decrease in rotations per minute. While we're on the subject of fans, the P500A's fan motors seemed to get warm under load, even without the LEDs activated. This is, however, anecdotal, since we don't ever measure fan temperature as part of our testing. But it's something to keep an eye on if the case fans are expected to run at full speed 24/7 for the life of the case. Next up is noise normalized testing, where we equate the combined case fan and fixed cooler fan noise levels to the same 36 dBA total at 20 inches of distance. This number allows us to look at case efficiency with fewer variables. The only speed we're changing here versus the baseline tests is in the case fans, so we've removed that one aspect where some cases will brute force the speeds and others won't. We moved this section forward in the testing from its usual place because of how impressive the P500A's performance was here. We don't want to bury the lead by leaving this for later, and it's an important result. CPU temperature at the lower noise level was 50 degrees over ambient, not significantly higher than the baseline torture result. We can assume a 1 degree-ish margin of error or test variance, but no matter what, it's still a huge achievement. The P500A was already competitive at 50 degrees on the normal CPU torture chart against other cases with their fans at full speed, and on the noise normalized chart, it's at the absolute top. The previous champion was the Phanteks P400A RGB, rounded to 51 degrees CPU DT, but within 1 degree of the P500A's average. On the same chart, but highlighting GPU temperatures instead, the GPU delta was also 50 degrees. It's a couple degrees warmer than the torture test baseline, but still impressively close. Again, this is one of the best GPU temperature results we've gotten on this chart, and out of the cases configured with only stock fans, it is the best. It's tied with the $35 Zonda O, which has a fan pointed straight at the GPU, despite otherwise being sort of a comical case to be at the top of a chart. Someday, manufacturers will remember that they can put fans on the sides of cases, but for now, that victory belongs to Zonda, but not that Zonda. The P500A beat both the P400A and the TD500 mesh by 2 degrees and some change in this test. This amount of cooling at this noise level is incredible, and nearly all the cases that do well in this test are high airflow cases. And that's because oftentimes it's better for noise if you can get an open case and bring down the fan RPMs rather than running higher RPMs to try and overcome the thicker case panels with all of the foam. Open cases can afford to run their fans at lower speeds, and they therefore often end up quieter than the sealed off cases. CPU temperature for the Blender CPU exclusive render was 36 degrees over ambient, tied with the high performance Be Quiet 500DX case and the Cooler Master H500 blank mesh. The TD500 case and the P400A were slightly warmer, even though the P400A was ahead in the original torture test. This may indicate that the CPU's temperature is being more affected by GPU heat in the P500A's torture testing, which isn't an issue as much in this lighter workload. Using the GPU to render raised GPU temperature to 21 degrees Celsius over ambient, the lowest result on this chart so far, and that puts it ahead of even cases with direct GPU cooling like the SL600M. The P400A was 2 degrees warmer in this test. The CPU temperature here was also cooler than the P400A's, although the TD500 mesh has them both beaten in this category. The 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme test resulted in an average GPU temperature within error of the baseline result of 47 degrees. That result is just as impressive in this test, again nearly equaling the performance of the SL600M, which has two 200mm fans at the bottom pointed straight into the GPU cooler. The TD500 mesh and P400A tied here at 49 degrees Celsius. The P500A is great at both CPU and GPU cooling so far, but GPU cooling is where it really pulls ahead of Phanteks' own older cases. Our next testing is with standardized fans in all cases, which has a number of important caveats and shortcomings methodologically that we've pointed out in the past. This was highly viewer requested, so we added it, but please educate yourself on the limitations of this test by clicking the link to our research piece below. These standardized fan results are more useful if they're treated as results for the P500A non-digital. No one should be buying the digital variant with the intention of swapping out the digital part of it, the ARGB fans, when they could just instead buy the P500A non-D for $30 less. CPU temperature with the standardized fans was 44 degrees over ambient, even better than baseline. This hasn't always been true in our tests of similar cases, but the P500A is large enough that an exhaust fan can be beneficial by focusing cooling where it's needed. 44 degrees ties it with the P400A for the best result on the chart so far, which makes sense. Identical fans, similar front panel design, it's where it should be. GPU temperature averaged 47 degrees in this test, rounding to 1 degree lower than baseline, but in reality, it's almost exactly the same. That ties it with the Cooler Master TD500 mesh and is beaten only by the cases with direct GPU cooling. We placed the two 140mm intake fans as low as possible without going below the level of the power supply shroud to effectively balance CPU and GPU cooling, and the result is overall slightly better than baseline. It's not enough to really matter overall. The results show that the cooling potential of the P500A matches some of the best that we've tested. And then on top of that, the stock fans are good enough to take advantage of the potential. Patrick and I both think that this case is really good build quality. The thermals are highly competitive. Patrick wrote most of the review, almost the entire review, the build section, the thermal section. So we are in agreement that this case, for the price, is a good thermal performer. It's the chart topper in a few of the charts. It's exceptional and noteworthy primarily for its noise normalized performance, meaning you set all the cases to the same noise level with their included fans, and this one comes out on top. That's a big victory, and that's why we pulled that chart forward in the review this time. So versus the P400A, it's a bit bigger. It has dual system support. That's not something we think a lot of people will use, and you can watch our Evolv X review, you probably should, for our thoughts on dual systems in a case of similar size. Our testing revealed that even with the two 140mm fans we used for the buy-it-yourself approach, performance remains good and competitive. So you can go either way. We'd recommend the DRGB version over the base model, but if you really want to supply your own fans, it's a decent starting point. So then, at $100 for the non-digital, it's fine, but the one we find the most interesting is the $130 DRGB version. Its direct competitors would be things like the Cooler Master H500 series, specifically the mesh variants. So you'd be looking at the H500P mesh, which is the white case. You'd be looking at the H500 blank, no letter at the end. Mesh comes with acrylic and mesh, put the mesh one in there, and then I guess that's mostly it from Cooler Master's side. So those are similarly priced within the ballpark anyway. For other cases, the P400A digital obviously is a direct competitor to this from Phanteks. Looks about the same, bit smaller, a bit cheaper. The Lian Li O11 Dynamic makes a lot of sense as well. Similarly priced. That's a supply your own fans case, but has superb build quality and is one of the highest build quality cases we've worked with in recent years. Other competitors would include the recently reviewed Cooler Master TD500 Mesh. It's a bit cheaper than this one, actually. It's about $30 cheaper. Same price as the base model P500A. So these are all good thermal performers. They're close enough that really you're choosing on looks and other small features at that point. We've gone through all those in the reviews. So that's it for this one. Overall, the P500A we would say is a good case. It is, in terms of thermals, one of the best cases. In terms of build quality, it has advanced versus Phanteks' previous cases, especially the very old tooling from the P400. So it's good. If you want to buy it, then cool. We don't really have any problems with that. There's also a lot of competition, though, if for some reason you don't like how it looks or it's missing something. So we've listed those for you. That's it for this one, though. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus, and we'll see you all next time.